Welcome to the Chapter 20 overview, Colonial Encounters, 1750 to 1914. Main idea. 19th century European imperialism was an effect of the Industrial Revolution, with a variety of social, political, cultural, and economic effects in Asia and Africa. Relevance. A big story around the world for the last 200 years has been the spread of industrialization. It led to the dominance of Western culture, which is still with us today. Look at these street signs. A number of current events are also legacies of the political divisions caused by imperialism, which is the subject of this chapter. Setting the stage. Imperialism is the takeover and administration of a colony for political and economic gain. During the 19th century, most of Africa and Asia was controlled by a handful of nations in Europe, as well as the United States and Japan. The first wave of colonial activity, if you'll remember from a previous chapter, was the European conquest of the Americas. After colonies in the Americas got their independence in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, industrialized nations turned their attention to Africa and Asia as sources of natural resources and labor to drive the economic engine of the industrial world. And that's what this chapter talks about, extending industrialization to other parts of the world for the benefit of nations that had already industrialized. First red heading is called a second wave of European conquests. European nations and Japan created both formal and informal empires in Africa and Asia for the political and economic benefit of the conquering country. Most of Asia was controlled by European nations and Japan. If you look at this map here, you can see the countries that are imperializing are Great Britain, the Netherlands, France, the United States here in the Philippines, and Japan on the peninsula of Korea. Much of China and, of course, India is controlled by Britain. The Netherlands controlled this part of the world down here, which we now call Indonesia. And France had control in what was called Indochina at the time, and which we now call Vietnam and Laos. Imperialism also extended to Africa. On this slide, you can see a map of Africa split up by which country controlled each part of Africa. And the countries represented are the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Portuguese, the Belgians, the Spanish. If you look at the colors, most of Africa is either French, that's this red color here, or pink, which is controlled by the British. There are two independent nations in Africa. Ethiopia, which resisted takeover by the Italians, and this country here called Liberia, which was founded by freed slaves from the United States. And if you look at their flag, you will see the resemblance between the Liberian flag and the American flag. So that's what this chapter is about, the causes and effects of this wave of imperialism in the 19th century. The next red heading is called Under European Rule. European imperialist nations imposed a great degree of control over their subjects, provoking both cooperation and rebellion. Cooperation and rebellion. There were some benefits to colonial rule, such as Western-style education and the chance for advancement. In many cases, European rule depended on local rulers as middlemen to enforce their policies. Thus, they created a ruling class made up of princes, emirs, and others who had incentive to cooperate with Europeans. However, there was also formal resistance, most notably the Indian Rebellion of 1857, in which Hindu and Muslim soldiers cooperated against British rule. On an interesting note, this rebellion was sparked by the fact that the bullets for their rifles of Indian soldiers were greased with animal fat, which was offensive to both Hindus and Muslims. It was either the fat of a cow or a pig. The rebellion was crushed, but made the British more cautious in India. Colonial empires with a difference. Europeans employed their theory of scientific racism to justify and extend their control of subjects in Africa and Asia, especially in South Africa, in which the British reorganized society entirely along racial lines. This helped them to maintain their control during the time of imperialism. So there's definitely a racist quality to this era of takeover. The next heading is called Comparing Colonial Economies. Imperialist nations used a variety of methods to compel subjects to work on the behalf of the conquering country. And your book talks about three main economic systems. And the first is referred to as Economies of Coercion. This is forcing people to work. In many cases, Europeans brutally forced subjects to work for them. Two famous examples are rubber production in the Belgian colony of the Congo, in which the Belgians maimed locals who did not work enough, as shown in this picture here. And also the cultivation system in Indonesia, in which farmers were forced to sell cash crops to the Dutch rulers at fixed prices. Both of these methods enriched the Europeans while devastating the locals. The next type of economic system is called cash crop agriculture. Remember that a cash crop is one produced not for individual consumption, but for mass production, for sale to a worldwide market. Examples during this time were rice, which is shown here, and cocoa. In many cases, the development of cash crop agriculture benefited local farmers by providing a steady income and protection from European rulers. But it often had negative environmental effects and created a dangerous dependence on a single market, which could be a problem if the global price went down. And the last type is called wage labor. And if you'll recall, one of the incentives in industrialization is cheap labor. And so in Africa and in Asia, a great deal of workers were paid, but paid typically very low wages. This picture shows a Lipton tea plantation in Ceylon. Workers were also employed in mines, in homes as servants, and eventually in factories. Pay was generally low and working conditions were poor. As the cities grew in the colonies, many workers moved for work, and skilled laborers sometimes found elite status in those newly formed cities. And the last heading in this section looks at the role of women in these economies. And what it explains to you is that due to the changing nature of colonial economies, women often had more social and economic responsibility. Many men switched to farming cash crops, leaving women responsible for domestic food production. In many cases, men also migrated to cities, and women stayed behind and managed the household while providing for it economically, often providing additional food for the men in the cities. There's an important element of migration in this process, either within a colony, typically from the rural areas to cities, or in many cases, from the colony to the home country. And that typically is migration done by men, which increases the responsibility and roles of women in those social systems. Assessing colonial development. This is a section that looks at the effects of imperialism. Overall, this process definitely modernized Asia and Africa, bringing them further into the global economy with both positive and negative effects, which are shown here in this picture of Lagos, Nigeria. There were some positives, but it's also clear that these areas were not able to modernize to the extent that a country like Japan, for instance, was able to, which went through this process independently. Whether this is due to European policies or local social conditions is a matter of great debate among historians. The last red heading is called Identity and Cultural Change in the Colonial Era. Imperialist rule had profound effects on the cultural characteristics of European colonies, especially in the areas of education, religion, and racial identity. Education. Western-style education was designed largely to assimilate the local population into European values, but it could also provide a vehicle for advancement in the society with access to higher-paying jobs. In this photo, we have the King of Siam, clearly showing the influence of Western culture on his country. Generally, though, education did not protect one from the racist views of European colonists, and inequality remained. In the future, many independence movements in the 20th century would be organized by Western educated elites and individual colonies. Gandhi in India is an example of this phenomenon. Next, the book talks about religion. Imperialism had a profound effect on religion. In Africa, as shown in this map, Christianity saw much conversion, often incorporating African traditions, similar to the conversion of Western Europeans to Christianity before the time of Constantine. In India, religious scholars solidified the teachings of Hinduism as an alternative to Christianity. This will contribute to a significant split between Hindus and Muslims in India in the 20th century. And the last heading is called Race and Tribe. Africa is extremely diverse ethnically. All the different colors on this map represent different ethnic, cultural, and linguistic groups. In Africa, racial identity took on various forms. Some thinkers, such as Edward Blyden, responded to colonialism by discussing Africans as a people with a united set of values and characteristics. Others discussed African identity as consisting of a number of tribes. In some cases, Europeans created tribes that did not previously exist, so that they could administer their colonies more conveniently. In others, Africans created tribes as a source of identity under European rule. Generally, imperialism had significant racial consequences, particularly in Africa. Now for the 10-second spice review. Imperialism had significant effects across colonies in Africa and Asia. Gender roles changed due to economic demands placed on the imperious colonies established by industrialized nations. Labor conditions were often determined by the geography and environment of colonies, and colonial empires had profound effects on religion and racial classifications. Imperialist nations employed a variety of labor systems designed to enrich their own economies. And finally, a visual summary. Here we have the process of industrialization creates a demand for resources and labor, and that demand leads to imperialism in Africa and in Asia. And that imperialism had various effects on the colonies, and your book focuses on social effects, political effects, cultural effects, and economic effects. That's our overview for Chapter 20. Happy reading!
I no be gentleman at all. I no be gentleman at all. I no be gentleman at all. Da 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 da.